Nothing more than a formal portrait from the 1860s. 3 young women in elegant silk dresses, their posture perfect, their expressions calm. The kind of image you might walk past in a museum without a second thought. But something about this photograph caught the attention of a historian in 2019. Something hidden in the way the sisters held their hands. Something that had gone unnoticed for over 150 years. What she discovered would rewrite everything we thought we knew about resistance, survival, and the silent war fought in plain sight. These 3 women weren't just posing for a portrait, they were sending a message their captors never understood. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. You won't want to miss what comes next. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Harrison's auction house in Richmond, Virginia, as Dr. Amelia Grant examined a collection of Civil War-era photographs scheduled for sale. At 43, she had spent 2 decades studying American history at Howard University, but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to find. The collection belonged to the estate of a recently deceased antiques dealer who had spent 50 years accumulating photographs from the antebellum South. Most were unremarkable. Stiff portraits of wealthy families, images of plantation houses, formal gatherings frozen in silver and glass. Then Amelia's fingers stopped on a particular photograph. 3 young black women sat in an ornate parlor, dressed in silk gowns that would have been expensive even by the standards of wealthy white families. Their hair was elegantly styled, their posture impeccable. But it was their hands that made Amelia's breath catch in her throat. Each sister held her hands in a distinct position on her lap. The eldest had her right hand placed over her left, fingers slightly spread. The middle sister's hands were clasped, but her thumbs crossed in an unusual pattern. The youngest rested one hand flat, while the other formed a subtle shape against the dark fabric of her skirt. Amelia had seen hand positions in Victorian photographs before. They were common, often dictated by photographers seeking aesthetic balance. But these positions felt deliberate, coded, intentional. She turned the photograph over. On the back, faded handwriting read, "The Kingsley Sisters, Charleston, 1863. "Find something interesting?" asked Marcus Webb, the auction house director, appearing beside her. "These women," Amelia said, not taking her eyes off the photograph. "Do you know anything about them?" Marcus shrugged. The previous owner had no documentation. "We assumed they were free women of color, perhaps from a wealthy family. The dresses alone suggest significant means." Amelia studied the image again. Something wasn't right. In 1863, Charleston was deep in Confederate territory. The idea of 3 black women sitting for such an elaborate portrait, dressed in such finery during the height of the Civil War, seemed almost impossible. "I'd like to purchase this photograph," she said quietly. "The entire collection is being sold as one lot." Amelia looked up at him. "Then I'll take the entire collection." Back in her office at Howard University, Amelia pinned the photograph to her research board and began her investigation. The first question was simple. Who were the Kingsley sisters? She started with census records from Charleston in the 1860s. Free black families were rare in South Carolina, and those with significant wealth were even rarer. After 3 days of searching, she found nothing. No Kingsley family appeared in any record she could locate. She expanded her search to include church records, property transactions, and tax documents. Nothing. "It's like they didn't exist," she muttered to her graduate assistant David, who had become equally obsessed with the mystery. "Maybe Kingsley wasn't their real name," David suggested. "If they were hiding something, they might have used an alias." Amelia considered this. It made sense. But why would 3 black women need to hide their identity in a photograph? And who had taken the picture in the first place? She examined the photograph under magnification, searching for any identifying marks. Victorian photographers often stamped their work, leaving signatures or studio names embossed on the cardstock. Then she found it. In the lower right corner, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny embossed seal. J.R. Whitmore, Charleston. A quick search revealed that Jonathan Whitmore had operated a photography studio in Charleston from 1858 to 1867. He was white, from a prominent family, and had documented much of Charleston's elite society during the war years. But why would a white photographer from a Confederate family take such an elaborate portrait of 3 black women? Amelia dug deeper into Whitmore's history and discovered something unexpected. After the war, Whitmore had moved north to Boston, where he became involved with abolitionist causes and donated significant sums to freedmen's schools. "He changed sides," Amelia said, staring at the screen. "Or maybe he was never on the side we assumed." The next morning, she booked a flight to Charleston. The answers she needed weren't in databases or archives. They were in the city where the photograph had been taken, buried in the history that Charleston preferred to forget. Charleston in October still carried the weight of summer, the air thick with humidity and the scent of magnolias. Amelia checked into a small hotel near the historic district and made her way to the Charleston County Public Library's South Carolina room. The archivist, an elderly woman named Dorothy, listened carefully as Amelia explained her research. Jonathan Whitmore, Dorothy repeated, her eyes narrowing. That's a name I haven't heard in years. My grandmother used to speak of him. Amelia leaned forward. Your grandmother knew him? Knew of him. She was a child during Reconstruction, but she remembered the stories. Whitmore wasn't just a photographer. According to family legend, he was something far more dangerous to the Confederacy. Dorothy led Amelia to a restricted section of the archive, where fragile documents were kept in climate-controlled cases. She retrieved a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. This was donated anonymously in 1952, Dorothy explained. We never knew who it belonged to until a researcher in the 1980s identified the handwriting as Whitmore's. Amelia opened the journal carefully. The entries were cryptic, filled with references to packages delivered and routes confirmed. Then she found an entry dated March 1863. The three sisters sat for their portrait today. The message is embedded. If our friends in the North understand the code, the next passage will proceed as planned. God protect them all. Amelia's hands trembled. He was using photographs to send coded messages. Dorothy nodded slowly. The Underground Railroad didn't end when the war began. It transformed, and Whitmore was part of it. Amelia photographed the journal entry and continued reading. The sisters, Whitmore wrote, were not named Kingsley at all. Their real names were Clara, Ruth, and Viola. They had escaped from a plantation in Georgia 3 years earlier, and had been living under assumed identities in Charleston, working as seamstresses for a sympathetic white family. But they weren't just survivors. They were conductors. Amelia spent the next week tracing every reference to Clara, Ruth, and Viola in Whitmore's journal. The photographer had been meticulous, recording not only his subjects, but also the system they had developed together. The hand positions in the photographs weren't random. They were a language. According to Whitmore's notes, the sisters had created a visual code based on hand placements, finger positions, and the arrangement of objects in the frame. Each combination conveyed specific information: safe houses, dangerous routes, times of passage, names of allies and enemies. The photographs were then distributed through a network of abolitionists disguised as art collectors, traveling merchants, and even Confederate sympathizers who had secretly switched allegiances. The images passed through checkpoints and inspections without suspicion because they looked like nothing more than ordinary portraits. It was hiding in plain sight, Amelia explained to David over a video call. The Confederates saw what they expected to see: black women in fancy clothes, probably servants dressed up by their owners for a vanity portrait. They never imagined these women were sending military intelligence right under their noses. David was silent for a moment. How many photographs are we talking about? Amelia checked her notes. Whitmore's journal mentions at least 40 portraits taken between 1862 and 1865. Most featured the sisters, but some included other members of the network. Each photograph carried different information. And the one you found at the auction? Amelia looked at the photograph pinned to her board. According to the journal entry from March 1863, this image confirmed that the Combahee River route was safe for passage. 3 months later, Harriet Tubman led the Combahee River Raid, freeing over 750 enslaved people. The implication hit David immediately. Are you saying the sisters helped plan the raid? I'm saying their photograph might have been part of the intelligence that made it possible. Amelia's research led her to the descendants of the white family who had sheltered the sisters in Charleston. The family's records had been preserved by a great-great-granddaughter named Helen, who lived in a restored antebellum home on the outskirts of the city. Helen was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and cautious. She had spent years protecting her family's complicated history and was reluctant to share it with strangers. My ancestors were Confederate, she said, pouring tea in her formal parlor. At least that's what their neighbors believed. The truth was more complicated. She explained that her great-great-grandmother Elizabeth had run a seamstress business that employed free black women. On the surface, it was a respectable enterprise. In reality, it was a cover for one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of the Civil War. Elizabeth's husband was a Confederate officer, Helen continued. He had access to troop movements, supply routes, military plans. He passed that information to Elizabeth, who encoded it in dress patterns and fabric designs. The seamstresses then incorporated those patterns into the clothing they made. And the photographs? Amelia asked. Helen nodded. The dresses in Whitmore's portraits weren't just beautiful. They were messages. The pattern of lace on a collar, the number of buttons on a sleeve, the arrangement of ribbons. Everything meant something. Amelia's mind raced. The sisters weren't just posing with coded hand positions. Their entire outfits were part of the message. How was the information decoded? Helen rose and walked to an old secretary desk. She retrieved a small, worn booklet and handed it to Amelia. This was my great-great-grandmother's cipher guide. It explains how to read the patterns. Amelia opened the booklet with trembling hands. Inside were detailed drawings of dress elements paired with their meanings. A rose pattern meant safe passage. Vertical stripes indicated danger. A specific arrangement of lace communicated the number of people waiting for transport. The sisters hadn't just been sending messages, they had been transmitting entire escape plans. Armed with the cipher guide, Amelia returned to the photograph of the three sisters and began decoding every element. The process took days of careful analysis, cross-referencing Whitmore's journal with Elizabeth's cipher and historical records of the period. The message hidden in the March 1863 photograph was more detailed than Amelia had imagined. Clara's hand position indicated a date range, the first week of June. Ruth's clasped hands with crossed thumbs specified a location, the Combahee River ferry crossing. Viola's flat palm and curved fingers communicated a number, approximately 700. The dress patterns added layers of detail. The lace on Clara's collar indicated that Union gunboats would provide cover. The buttons on Ruth's sleeves confirmed that local guides had been secured. The ribbon arrangement on Viola's bodice named the operation's leader, a woman known by the code Moses, Harriet Tubman. Amelia sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. The Combahee River raid had been one of the most successful military operations led by a woman in American history. Tubman had guided Union forces up the river, liberating over 750 enslaved people in a single night. Historians had long wondered how Tubman had obtained such precise intelligence about Confederate positions, mine placements, and the locations of plantation slave quarters. Now Amelia had the answer. The intelligence had been gathered by a network of black women working in plain sight, encoded in photographs and dress patterns, and transmitted through a system so elegant that the Confederacy never suspected it existed. They were spies, Amelia whispered, the most effective spies of the Civil War, and history forgot them completely. She thought of all the monuments to Confederate generals, all the textbooks that celebrated military strategists, all the museums that preserved the weapons and uniforms of war. Yet these three women, whose courage and intelligence had helped free hundreds of people, had vanished from memory entirely. Until now. The question that haunted Amelia was what had happened to Clara, Ruth, and Viola after the war. Whitmore's journal ended in 1865, and Elizabeth's records made no mention of the sisters after Richmond fell. She began searching Freedmen's Bureau records, which documented the lives of formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. The records were incomplete, often damaged, and spread across multiple archives. But after weeks of searching, she found a reference that made her heart stop. A registration document from Savannah, Georgia, dated November 1865, listed three sisters applying for marriage licenses on the same day, Clara, Ruth, and Viola. The document noted that all three were formerly of Charleston and worked as teachers. Amelia traced the sisters to a freedmen's school established by Northern missionaries in Savannah. The school's records, preserved at a university archive in Atlanta, contained staff lists, student rosters, and annual reports. Clara had taught reading and writing to adults who had been forbidden to learn during slavery. Ruth had specialized in mathematics and accounting, preparing students for economic independence. Viola had taught music and, according to one report, had an extraordinary gift for codes and ciphers, which she employed in teaching children to read. Vart Pi, the sisters had continued their work, transforming from spies into educators, using the same skills that had helped free hundreds of people to lift thousands more out of illiteracy. Amelia also found a letter Clara had written to a Northern benefactor in 1867. We were never named in the histories of the war. We were not generals or politicians. We were seamstresses and photographers' subjects. But we knew that freedom required more than battles. It required intelligence, patience, and the courage to hide in plain sight. We do not seek recognition. We seek only to ensure that those who come after us will never be invisible again. Amelia read the letter again and again, each time discovering new layers of meaning. The sisters had known they would be forgotten. They had accepted it, and they had continued their work anyway. Amelia's research eventually led her to living descendants of the three sisters. Through genealogical records, DNA databases, and countless phone calls, she traced family lines that had spread from Savannah to Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. The first descendant she contacted was Michael, a retired postal worker in Chicago whose great-great-grandmother was Ruth. He had never heard of the photographs or the coded messages. My family always said our ancestors were teachers, he told Amelia over the phone. And we knew they had been through slavery, but the details were lost. People didn't talk about those times. In Detroit, she found Patricia, a school principal descended from Clara. Patricia wept when Amelia showed her the photograph. She looks like my daughter, Patricia whispered. The same eyes, the same way of holding her head. I never knew what she looked like before. The most emotional meeting was with James, a musician in Atlanta descended from Viola. He had inherited his great-great-great-grandmother's love of music without ever knowing its origin. She taught music? He asked, staring at the photograph. In a freedmen's school? She taught codes through music, Amelia explained. Songs that contained hidden messages, rhythms that encoded information. She turned resistance into art. James was silent for a long time. Then he picked up his guitar and began to play a melody his grandmother had taught him as a child. A melody passed down through generations without explanation. "I always wondered where this song came from," he said quietly. "Now I know." The descendants gathered together for the first time at Amelia's invitation, meeting in Charleston, near the site where Whitmore's studio had once stood. They stood in a circle, holding copies of the photograph, connected by a history that had nearly been erased. Amelia published her findings in a historical journal, accompanied by high-resolution images of the photograph, Whitmore's journal entries, and Elizabeth's cipher guide. The academic response was immediate and enthusiastic. Historians praised the discovery as one of the most significant revelations about Civil War-era resistance in decades. But Amelia wasn't satisfied with academic recognition alone. She approached the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture with a proposal: acquire the photograph and create an exhibit dedicated to the invisible intelligence networks of the Civil War. The museum agreed. The exhibit, titled Hidden in Plain Sight: The Secret War of the Seamstress, Spies, opened 18 months later. It featured the original photograph of Clara, Ruth, and Viola, along with Whitmore's journal, Elizabeth's cipher guide, and dozens of related artifacts that researchers had uncovered following Amelia's initial discovery. The centerpiece was an interactive display where visitors could decode photographs using the sisters' system, experiencing firsthand the ingenuity required to resist oppression in an era when even literacy was forbidden. On opening night, the descendants of the three sisters stood together before the exhibit. Michael, Patricia, James, and 17 other family members from across the country had gathered to honor their ancestors. Patricia spoke for the group. For over 150 years, our grandmothers were invisible. History recorded the generals and the politicians, the battles and the treaties, but it forgot the women who sewed messages into dresses, who posed for photographs that carried secrets, who risked everything to help others find freedom. Tonight, they are invisible no more. The photograph of Clara, Ruth, and Viola hung in a place of honor, illuminated by soft light that reached hands. Hands that had spoken a language of defiance. Hands that had helped change history. Amelia returned to Charleston 1 year after the exhibit opened. She walked through the historic district, past the elegant homes and the tourist carriages, past the monuments and the markers that told one version of the city's history. She stopped at the corner where Whitmore's studio had once stood. The building was gone now, replaced by a boutique hotel, but a small plaque had been installed at Amelia's request. On this site stood the photography studio of Jonathan Whitmore, where images of resistance were created during the Civil War. The subjects of his most important work, Clara, Ruth, and Viola, used coded hand positions and dress patterns to transmit intelligence that helped free hundreds of enslaved people. Their courage remained hidden for over 150 years. Amelia touched the plaque gently, then walked to the waterfront, where the Combahee River flowed toward the sea. She thought about all the other photographs from that era, sitting in archives and attics, dismissed as ordinary portraits. How many of them contained messages that had never been decoded? How many other stories were waiting to be discovered? She thought about the sisters who had known they would be forgotten and had resisted anyway, who had understood that some acts of courage are performed not for recognition, but for the simple, stubborn belief that freedom matters, even when no one is watching. And she thought about the photograph itself, that small rectangle of silver and glass that had survived wars, neglect, and the deliberate erasure of black history. It had waited patiently for someone to look closely enough to see what it really was. Not just a portrait, a declaration. A testament to the power of ordinary people who refused to be silent, who found ways to speak even when speaking was forbidden, who hid their resistance in plain sight until the world was finally ready to see it. Amelia pulled out her phone and took a photograph of the plaque, the river, the sky. Then she sent it to the descendants with a simple message: they are remembered. They will not be forgotten again.